I'm going to Sarah Curran, I just want to run a few reminders for those of you online and in the room. Next week, we have Rob Krosnow from the University of Texas, who will be talking about young adulthood and transitions to adulthood. And then, and mental health and well-being. And then the week after that, we have our lightning talks. And I do invite all of you to come to the lightning talks in person. We have them in Raid Hall, and it's graduate students presenting their research. We have some snacks, and we have opportunities for them to do a few quick, short presentations, and then you can chat with each of them about their work. And look for the highlights about that lightning talk in eNews. And if you haven't gotten eNews, you should sign up for eNews. We have tons of information in eNews. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our amazing seminar organizer, Rowan Arar, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. How are y'all doing today? I have the privilege of introducing our speaker.
Hi, y'all.
This is Gabriella Levy, who is an assistant professor in political science. She was previously a postdoctoral research associate at the Center for Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at Brown University, as well as a Jennings Randolph Peace Scholar Fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace. I want to hear more about that. She holds a PhD in political science from Duke, as well as a BA in political science from Columbia University. And her research explores the ways people interact, evaluate, and respond to various forms of political violence, ranging from wartime civilian targeting to vigilantism to repression. Her work focuses on Latin America, primarily using survey methods, and draws on international relations, comparative politics, and political psychology. So with that, please join me in welcoming our speaker.
So, hi y'all, thank you so much for being here today. There are lots of new faces and people I don't know. So thank you so much. I look forward to your thoughts. And I also look forward to when you're standing up here, hearing what you're working on. So today I'm gonna be talking about a working paper. So it is still very much a work in progress and changes can still be made. This paper is called Who Deserves Police Restraint? Social Threat in Attitudes Towards Protest Policing. And it's with two great co-authors, Erica de Bruin at Hamilton College and Livia Schubiger at ETH Zurich. Just as a quick outline of what I'm going to be talking about, the research question here is what determines support for police repression in times of social protests? What we will be arguing is that although previous work suggests that perceptions of protest violence increase support for repression, we think that protests that violate social norms are also seen as less deserving of restraint or more deserving of repression, even when those protests don't pose a physical threat. In making this argument, empirically, we look at gender-related protests in Bogota, Colombia. And what we find is that support for freedoms of assembly and freedoms of speech are sensitive to the perceived normative subversiveness of protest demands and tactics. Just given where I am, I'm gonna spend a little bit more time than usual talking about survey methodology, because I think that's where I probably intersect with some of you. So the motivation for this project is, unsurprisingly, democratic backsliding. So according to the Varieties of Democracy Institute, 2024 was the first year in 20 years where the world had fewer democracies than it had autocracies. And importantly, autocratization and democratic backsliding often happens with the consent and the support of the public, right? People sometimes support these policies that are integral to democratic backsliding. For example, people are often willing to trade off democratic values in favor of other things like partisanship, ideology, and leader competence. And there has, of course, been lots of work on sort of public support for democratic backsliding, but this existing work primarily focuses on legislative and judicial constraints on the executive, as well as sort of electoral institutions and freedom of the press. Whereas in this project, we're looking at the right to free speech and the right to free assembly, and specifically considering when those rights are infringed upon through protest repression. And, you know, indeed, there is public support sometimes for repression of protests. And the reason that protests are so important to thinking about democratic backsliding is that sort of a key element of democracy is contestation. And we can think about contestation as the ability of citizens to challenge the conduct of their governments, right? So protests, the repression of protests is a direct sort of infringement of this essential element of democracy, which is contestation. And, protests are also sort of very risky for regimes that are autocratic or autocratizing. And indeed, protests have played a key role in halting this process around the world. But despite sort of the central importance of the right to contest, including the right to protest, in a lot of democracies, less than half of the public agrees that people who criticize the government have a right to protest, right? This is sort of a hotly contested subject, even if sort of theoretically we might know that it's an important element of democracy. So what we argue in this paper is we think about ways in which protest might pose a threat to regular people. And we can think about protest posing a threat in terms of either social threats or physical threats. So in thinking about social threats, we start with this sort of very basic understanding of social order as rules, norms, and practices that structure life in a predictable way. Importantly, under any given social order, everyone occupies a specific position and is expected to perform specific rules. And their deviations from these expectations can undermine or threaten the status quo. So in the context of gender-related activism or gender-related protests, deviations from traditional gender roles will be seen as social threats and thus be seen as deserving of police repression, right? So that's sort of the social threat half of this argument. The other half of this argument is not so novel. We agree with lots of other work that protests that are perceived to pose a physical threat will be seen as deserving of repression and less worthy of police restraint. So there has been some really interesting work on sort of protester identity and physical threats. So there have been findings around the world that people who are members of minority groups are more, so the public is more likely to support the repression of minorities, but these other works argue that is because they see minorities as more violent, right? So for them, identity works through physical threat to affect protest support, whereas we're arguing that we can actually disaggregate social threat and physical threats. So in thinking about physical threat and social threats, we can think about lots of different ways that protests might vary. So the first thing we can think about is goals and how the degree to which those goals or demands challenge gender norms. So what we hypothesize is that compared to protests demanding reductions in maternal mortality, protests that demand justice for victims of domestic violence will be seen as more deserving of police intervention. And even more so than those protests demanding justice for domestic violence victims that advocate increased abortion access or expansions of LGBTQ+ rights will be seen as even more deserving of police repression. We can also think about different tactics, right? So protests not only demand different things, they also use different tactics on the street. So we have here banging pots, which is, I think, an important thing to clarify in our context. So this survey is done in Latin America, where banging pots is a very traditional protest activity. And it's one that women can do from their home, right? They can stand in their window and bang their pots. So that is sort of the least gender subversive tactic that we look at. And what we argue is that in comparison to protests in which women bang pots, protests in which women block traffic will be seen as less deserving of police restraint. But even compared to blocking traffic, protests in which women go topless and throw rocks will be seen as even less deserving of police restraint. Now, this is something that we're going to talk about a lot when I talk to results, is this women going topless phenomenon. Because if attitudes were only about physical violence or even about like the disruptiveness of protests, then people just shouldn't care if women are topless, right? They would say, okay, like, if we care about physical threat, then like blocking the street, like, yeah, maybe that's like a little bit of a threat, but like going topless, like that doesn't actually physically influence anyone else. But unsurprisingly to us, people really care about women going topless. So we also think about protester and leader identity. And this is where we had alternate hypotheses because we really just didn't know what we were going to find. So we thought about mixed gender versus all women's protests. So on the one hand, women are seen as less violent, right? So female protests have a lower level of physical threat. But on the other hand, the presence of men in a protest about sort of gender-related issues suggests that the movement has built a broader coalition, right, and thereby could actually threaten the status quo. Similarly, we think about sort of whether leaders are tied to political organizations versus women's organizations, and we have sort of the same back and forth here. So political parties are a part of sort of the established political process, right? So they don't pose a social threat. But on the other hand, in the context that we're looking at, political parties are potentially associated with violence. So they have basically no social threat, but a relatively higher level of a physical threat. Conversely, leadership in women's organizations presents less of a physical threat. There aren't ties between women's organizations and armed groups in Colombia or in many parts of the world, but they do pose more of a deviation from women's natural roles, right? These are women taking on sort of complex, high-profile political advocacy. But we do think protests in which leaders have ties to armed groups, people aren't going to support that, right? That is sort of very clearly physically threatening. So I know I ran through that pretty fast. This is sort of a summary of how we're thinking about these different kinds of ways that protests can vary, right? So we talked through the ways that demands can vary, the gender composition of protests, leader affiliation, and tactics. And we tried to think through both physical and social threats and what that would mean for public support for these kinds of protests. Okay, any questions before I move on to methods? Yes.
This is better safe. What do we know in this context about how the public is even learning about the demands and tactics of protests?
Yeah.
And how accurate their information is?
Yeah, so there would be two different answers depending on which part of Colombia we were talking about. So this survey is only in Bogota, and that is where a significant majority of protests are occurring in the city. Protests are super common in, I don't know if I have, protests are super common in Colombia. So over a year before we sort of built this out, ACLED, which captures event data around the world, captured 1,800 protests in Colombia in the period of 1 year. A lot of them are in Bogota. If you go to the Colombian newspaper I read, they often have articles being like, they call it like today's mobility issues. And they'll just be like, there's a protest on this street. And there's a protest on this street. And this protest is doing this thing. It's super, super common in Colombia. And sometimes protests are politicized, right? Especially when they're movements. But there is certainly some like basic information, like who was there, that I think is pretty reliably reported. In more rural areas, I don't think we could say the same thing, that like when there are protests, people know about them, just given sort of a much different sort of information environment in more rural areas of Colombia. Any other theory questions? Okay, so as I noted, lots and lots of protests in Colombia. And importantly, there have been a lot of recent protests in favor of abortion, LGBTQ+ rights, and an end to violence against women. These are all sort of on the public agenda. And of course, there's also repression. So for example, the UN High Commission for Human Rights has found that 46 protesters were killed by state forces in the 2021 national strike. And importantly, protests related to gender are not exempt from police brutality. I think that was sort of the biggest design thing we kept getting hung up on. We were like, okay, if like the cops believe the women are weak, would they really be violent against them? And like, yes, at least in Colombia, that has happened. So experimentally, what we do is we have a conjoint design in which respondents are presented with 6 different protests, and the levels of all attributes are randomly varied in each protest. So essentially, every protest that they see will have a demand, but what the demand is varies across these 6 things that people see. And the way we introduce this is as follows. I'm going to present you with information about 6 imaginary protests taking place at the Plaza de Bolívar in front of Congress. Imagine that several hundred people attend each of these protests. After I describe each fictitious protest, I will ask you some questions about each protest and how you think that the police should respond to them. Even if you're not sure of your responses, please try your best to answer my questions as if the protests were real.
Go back to your table. So are you, okay. So the six.
I can show you, this is better. So this is the experimental design. So what we did, so what respondents would see and hear, they would be read. The protesters want justice for victims of domestic violence. Who's participating? Mostly women. And they would read through the list, but they would only be presented with one of these levels in each of the six. And then they would be presented with another one, and we would say, okay, I want you to forget about that previous protest. Now I'm going to tell you about a different one. And they would ask again.
And the combo would all be different, like the combination of possible pairing, possible for.
So
Would be very, really very.
So they're independently varied. So for every, what we call it, for every task or profile, every single attribute is independently randomly varied. So they could see, for example, 2 in a row that are mostly women. That's entirely possible, but mathematically, randomization at least worked out correctly. There's another form of conjoints where you present 2 profiles next to each other. We didn't do that because it's very hard in person for someone to process that much information. So we only have 1 profile at a time here. It's a fun design. I really like conjoints. They're a little bit overdone in my field, but conjoints, that's the experimental design. Yeah, it comes from marketing or advertising. So imagine that you're telling someone about Chobani and you present one that's strawberry and one that's vanilla, right? And it comes out of marketing. Yeah.
And do you change your order? I guess I'm wondering if 2 people at the 2 exact same scenarios or in different orders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we went back and forth about order. We didn't change attribute order, no, because respondents already sometimes sort of get confused. So we kept those constant. I don't think we have an analysis of whether anyone saw the same exact profile twice. I don't know what the probability would be mathematically, but there might be 1 or 2 in there.
I don't think anything to attribute. I mean, when you so if 2 people saw the same 2 conjoints,
Mhm.
did you switch the order in which did the same one always appear first?
Oh, so no, the same one did not always appear first because they're all randomized. So what the number is 4 times 2 times 3 times 4. That's how many options there are. Yeah. So it's not that we had 6 different profiles and gave them all to everyone. I should know off the top of my head that factorial, but I don't. Okay. So then after they were presented with one of these profiles, we asked them, please tell me on a scale from 1 to 7, where 1 is completely disagree and 7 is completely agree, to what extent do you agree with the following statement? The police should stand back and not intervene in this protest. So you may have noticed that as I talked through the theory, I sort of used support restraint and support repression. And this is sort of an inverse of what we're actually interested in. We are interested in support for repression, but that is obviously a controversial thing for people to indicate that they support. So we tried to lower social desirability bias by asking them instead about agreement that the police shouldn't intervene. Of course, we don't specify exactly what intervene means, right? So we're making sort of assumptions in asking this question that not intervening is the inverse of repression, and that people know that, right? Which is something that we can't necessarily validate except through talking to enumerators and people on the ground when we were piloting. But that's sort of given the extent of repression in Colombia, and also given the extent of just political violence in general, we didn't really feel comfortable asking people do you like police repression? So this is our sort of design choice. Yes.
You go on to ask about what the intervention would be at all?
No,
Okay.
we don't.
So if someone reads this and thinks, well, it depends if someone's attacking someone else.
Well, we vary tactics, right? So we have women throwing rocks. So we're not asking this in the abstract, we're asking about a specific protest.
Yes, but you are asking about the intervention in the abstract.
Mm-hmm.
And so that seems like it might, if nothing else, might be challenging for someone to know how to answer the question.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's definitely a flaw. And I think that we designed it knowing that it was flawed. So we thought about alternatives of being do you support the police using tear gas? Or being very explicit like that. And at the end of the day, we were nervous about being on the street and asking people about support for state violence. So like, this is a flawed variable, 100%. We don't know exactly what people mean when they say this. And that was sort of the trade-off.
It would help me if you could explain more about the context. Because if there are so many protests, I guess what I'm wondering is about the context of social movements and protesting. And I mean, you did say people were killed. I mean, in your earlier slide, but like, what is the general average nature of state?
Yeah. So the reason it's particularly tricky in Colombia is that we're not actually only talking about state repression, we're also talking about conflicts and pretty intense violations of like civilians amidst war, which is conceptually a different thing, right? But like Colombia has a long running civil conflict where the state and pro-state paramilitaries have both been involved in massacres and sort of targeting of individual civilians.
In Bogota?
In Bogota, not primarily, but it has happened there. And Bogota has a lot of displaced peoples who've moved into the city from rural areas. Is that a question? Let's see. Oh, someone's asking if we took attendance. I did not take attendance. Maybe someone else took attendance. Yeah.
Given that these protests are so different, when you say to someone, we could kind of economic, they have a general idea of what you're doing. If you go to Singapore and ask someone, meetings, it could be between governments, you guys have that it could be a traffic. Over here, when they hear the meeting, they might hear, okay, they're gonna really get off on it. So you're getting the effect of a not very abstract.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. Yeah, I mean, I remember I was once talking about this paper with two Colombian colleagues, and we were having this exact debate about the question. And I was like, have you guys ever been tear gassed? And they were like, yeah, of course. They were like, yeah, obviously we've been tear. I was like, what? Okay. Like these are like two academics, like they're not like, I don't know, radical protesters, but like they've been to protests and they're like, yeah, we've been tear gassed. I was like, cool, okay. So
intervention, like in our, not to say that about like right now, but like 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, like you would have asked us and what questions would be, intervening to separate people. And I mean, I'm not saying naive, but the nature in which we would imagine an intervention, the bucket of things that would be in an intervention would be mildish.
Yeah. I don't think that this means traffic tickets. But I mean, this is something that like we could, like, I mean, depending on how reviews come back, like this is totally something that we could do like some interviews with some people about, and just be like, when I say this, what do you mean? We obviously did that with sort of our survey firm, but that wasn't like a representative sample, right? So we don't have like data on the fact that they had some understanding.
Because in our current context, if you ask me this, I would think, well, yes, I think they should intervene to protect protesters against violent troops, right? So what does the police mean in that context?
There's a basically like a riot squad called ESMAD that is particularly controversial, but they're not the only police that are on the ground at protests. Yeah, but that's another good question if we talk to people about this. Okay.
Just ignore the comment.
Oh no, I went all the way. All right, that's okay. All right. Should we talk about sampling? Okay. So this is like, I really love sampling, so I apologize in advance if I'm like boring you with these details, but I think that they're fun. And I also think that they're like really important, and we're gonna spend enough time on them. So our target population was adults over the age of 18 in Bogota. We talked to 1,003 respondents between January and February of 2024. And our survey firm was SEI that handled enumeration. So within Bogota, there are 19 localities, and we stratified by them. And then within each locality, the number of blocks that we selected was proportional to the locality's projected 2023 population, according to DANE, which is Colombia Census Agency. But here's where it gets like crazy. So within each locality, we also stratified by size of blocks. as determined by the number of occupied dwellings in the 2018 census, but the cutoffs between these stratas varied by locality. So the number of distinct block size strata within each locality was determined by like how many blocks we were selecting. So if we were selecting like less than 10, we didn't do this. If we were selecting like 20 to 49 blocks to sample, we stratified this into 5. And I'll tell you why, because it seems unnecessary, but it was. So the issue in Bogota, which is very different than the issue in the US, is that rich people live in high rises, whereas poor people live in buildings with fewer floors. This is like the opposite of like what you would do if you were in New York, right? So what this means is that as a percentage of the population that they make up, richer residents are concentrated in a much smaller number of blocks because they're living in high rises. So if you randomly sampled blocks within each locality, that would lead to a lot of undersampling of wealthy residents who are already less likely to respond to your survey. So the terms that we use is vertical and horizontal property. So these are just 2 pictures from our pilot. So vertical property is where poor people live, you know, like 1 to 2, 3 families per building, whereas horizontal property is much taller. But in Colombia, a block is a square. So one block can have vastly different numbers of inhabitants. That was sort of the logic of this stratification. This is the number of blocks and surveys in block size stratas per locality, which probably doesn't matter to any of you, but it's helpful to us when we were enumerating this. So within each block, so after we stratify within locality by block size, we randomly selected our blocks within those stratas. We then send people to these blocks. And the trick in Colombia is that, so in the US, if you're looking at like a US survey, the US Postal Service has a list of everyone's addresses, and that just doesn't exist in Colombia. So we have blocks, but we don't know exactly like how many, like who is where, right? So we have like numbers of people roughly, but we don't have like addresses. So the enumerator had to write out every building on every block that we sampled. So they started in the corner with the highest number and letter of streets, and then they walked in a circle with their right shoulder to the wall. In this circle here is 1 block. So it's not one line here, which is what we would call a block in the US. It's 1 circle around in a block. Okay, questions about this thus far? Yes.
Did they publish the record of that block?
No, because that wouldn't, so we don't publish anything below the level of the locality for identifiability purposes. Yeah. But like as an intellectual community, it would be super helpful if survey researchers could do that. Any other questions? Okay. So within blocks, this is what I was saying, they're determining the number of inhabited dwellings, and then the software is randomly selecting dwellings. There are more than 80 dwellings on a block. The enumerator collected details of a random portion. And they worked on that with their supervisors. So like in the vertical properties I was showing you, they would be like, okay, there are like 200 people living on this block. So their supervisor would say, okay, I want you to write down floors 3 and 4 or something like that. Just because it takes so long, and we had to collect some data. So then the number of dwellings per block varied by socioeconomic level. So that we selected more households in richer areas because rich people don't like to answer the door. Interestingly, in Colombia, there are these 6 sort of governmentally determined socioeconomic levels, and they're defined by the government for the purposes of utility billing. And I've tried to find the formula, but it doesn't exist publicly. But what we can see is like, this is publicly available information, is like a strato number. So I like showing this. So you can look along this line between the pink and brown. That's Carrera 7. And there's a little, I've stayed a bunch of times right next to this sort of gray round park. And I have so much faith in the stratos because I know distinctly that when I go left out of this building that I always stay in because they have a bunch of Airbnbs, I can get much cheaper food than when I go right. But if I go right, then like I can get like fancy American coffee, which is nice. So you can look at this for anywhere in Colombia, and this is like a governmentally determined socioeconomic level. And it actually has to do with how much utilities you pay. So if you're richer, you pay more than your actual utility bill. And that goes to subsidizing people in lower socioeconomic levels. That's fun.
This is just a silly question, you don't have to.
No.
If you can bill somebody, why can't you get an app, why can't you have an address?
So, I mean, I think addresses exist somewhere, but they're not publicly accessible in a way that they can be used. Especially in rural areas, it's also like sometimes it's not like I've seen electricity bills and it's not like a specific number. They're just like hooked up to a meter, and that meter will display some readings. I think there's a database somewhere, but I don't have it and it's not public. Yes.
You can move within these, it's not more or less.
Yeah. Yep. It's not determined by your income. So if I choose to live in a poorer area, even if my then that's what matters, not the sort of the taxable income I have. Okay. So then within each dwelling, we're like, how many households are here? And we define households for them. And then within each household, we picked an adult. We selected men with a greater likelihood than women. Because it's just because of gendered working dynamics. So we didn't randomly sample adults. I did a previous survey with the same firm in rural areas, and we had such an imbalance. We had to like go back to towns because the men were like away, like working on the farm. And this is obviously there are no farms in Bogota, but we still had the same problem. So I'm not going to talk about this because it's more chaos than you need, but it's really, yeah. Okay. So here's what we ended up sampling. So you can see how many initial blocks were selected and then how many replacement blocks were selected. Replacement blocks happened when an entire block was inaccessible. And that primarily happened in these rich towers because there would be some manager on the first floor doing his or her job and being like, no, this is a nice place. You can't knock on their doors. And we'd be like, well, your building is the entire block. So we have to find another block. So you can see respondents from initial blocks and replacement blocks. And I think for the most part, we achieved our sort of anticipated number of respondents in each locality. In terms of thinking about like the demographics of our universe, i.e. Bogota versus like the sample, we have 54% women, which it took so much work. And then we have overrepresentation of Afro-Colombians and indigenous population compared to the city, which is cool. We're pretty good on electoral participation and on ideology if we measure that by vote for the current president. Our sample is obviously older than average because that is who was home during the day. I've gotten questions when I presented stuff like this before, like, why don't you just go back at night? I'm like, it's just like it's always risky to like send someone to a strange neighborhood and like have them walk on. So our enumerators only work during the day. We also have decent representation on like born in the area versus moved. Okay, results. All right, this is a little bit small. Yes, before I go to that.
Then specify the non-centered in their own pattern.
Yeah, so they're primarily from Bogota. And we didn't restrict them to not sampling their own localities. No. I don't know off the top of my head which localities they're from. I don't think this is too much of an issue in Bogota. It was an issue when we did a survey in rural areas because there's like a very strong urban rural divide. So like the language was different and the like income was very different. So it was more an issue in rural areas than when we did this survey, I think. There aren't the same sort of deep cleavages. Okay, so results. So the way to interpret this is the change in support for restraint for a given attribute level compared to the baseline attribute level. So the baseline attribute level, if we're talking about demands, is improvement in mental health. So what we can see here is compared to when a protest is demanding greater support for maternal health, protests demanding reduced discrimination against LGBTQ+ populations and improved abortion access are both less likely to support restraint. So in other words, they're more likely to support repression when these demands go against sort of the social norms. Interestingly, we had this whole sort of unclear hypotheses about gender, and indeed our results are null on those. We think that these could be sort of counteracting effects of physical and social threats. And I'll talk about that in a bit. And then down here in tactics, you can see that compared to banging pots, everything else is seen as less worthy of restraint. Disrupting traffic, going topless, and throwing rocks are all seen. One thing I forgot to mention is unsurprisingly, leader affiliation with an armed group is associated with less support for restraint, which makes sense if we're talking about physical threats. Yes, go for it.
So for the armed group one, but the effect doesn't seem that large.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, well, I guess I'm wondering how you interpret that.
Yeah.
Like,
So
as opposed to throwing rocks, which I can understand as like an immediate physical threat, but.
yeah. So numerically, you can't actually compare the effect sizes across attributes. You can compare across levels, but like from just like an equation perspective, like the size of one doesn't say anything about the size of another. So like maybe that's true, but maybe it's not.
It's only in comparison.
Exactly. So it's only in comparison to the baseline attribute, or if you change the baseline levels, you can get other comparisons within an attribute. Okay. So I think there are lots of alternative arguments here that are interesting. So the most obvious is that results are just driven by perceptions of violence or success. Like this is not about social threat. This is just about who people think pose physical threats. And that like doesn't seem to be true. So you can look at, for example, demands, and like none of these demands are seen as more likely to succeed or more violent. And in terms of sort of tactics, we can see that throwing rocks and disrupting traffic are both seen as more violent, which makes sense. We thought that these were physical threats. But going topless is not seen as a physical threat, even though people are less supportive of restraint for topless protesters. And obviously armed groups are also seen as more violent, and the participation of men. So like our priors about physical threat are sort of confirmed, but they can't explain all of our findings and sort of what we take away from this figure. Okay. And we only asked about perceptions of success and violence after the sixth half. So our confidence intervals are higher here because we have just fewer observations. The other alternative argument is like, this is just ideology, like just ask people their political choices, their political preferences. And we think like partially, but not fully. So we do find that support for police restraint varies significantly by ideology. So like right-wing respondents are just on average less supportive of restraint. But there's a difference between asking, is one group more or less supportive of restraint in general, and asking how does changing the attribute level affect their support of restraint? And that is what we're interested in. So if our findings were just a reflection of left-right ideological cleavages, we would expect to find more systematic differences between sort of these social threat related attribute levels among right-wing respondents than left-wing ones. So for example, if we're thinking about demands, left-wing respondents shouldn't care about the demand at all, and all of the effects should be in right-wing, and that's not what we find. Even people who agree with protest demands penalize women for behaving in transgressive ways, and perceptions of protest success and violence are not driven by respondent ideology. And I have some appendix figures if we want to talk through them, but they get really small, really complicated pretty fast. But I think this is, as we're thinking about the review process, like this is our big issue, is that like this is the obvious answer, and we have like probably like 3 pages in the manuscript talking about this, and like why we're not just capturing ideology. And I'm happy to talk through that, get your thoughts on like whether that's silly and this is just ideology. Okay, so that's all I have for today. I think I'm early. I'm like 3 minutes early. Yes. What's up? Yeah, Jamie.
So this is all interesting. I'm fascinated. I love it. It's great. And I guess there's sort of this initial question about what you're not hearing with Roman. So one question is like, one question you might want to ask you in general, somebody might want to, you might be So one question you might want to ask is, what do people think about protests in general?
Mhm.
And, should these go out there and stop protests in general? So you're not measuring that, you're measuring variation.
Mhm.
Is that correct?
Yes.
You're not, so there's not, you're not.
Yeah.
Maybe I would just add, so you never ask people if they've ever participated.
We don't. We ask them their ideology. I mean, I think we could have asked them that. That seems like it shouldn't be too sensitive. But I'm trying to remember if we did. Let's see. Do I have this table here? No, I don't think we asked. It would have been a good thing to ask. We ask ideology, which sort of gets at that, but it's different than like exercising politics outside of vote choice, I think.
And exposure to protests, given that you have people's residence, you have a measure of, could you localize, it sounds like you have data from.
Yeah.
Tribes to localize a protest.
Yeah, we don't have it, but we could do it. Like that.
But you don't know how long they've lived in that residence, so you wouldn't be able to necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, we could make some assumptions. It would be imperfect, but we could do it. We don't have super precise information about addresses or even like locations. We just have localities. But even then, there's still 19. One thing we do have victimization by the state in rebel groups, which is related but not identical. But it does get to like sort of.
Have you asked them about being victimized?
Yes, about being victimized by the state or by rebel groups.
And that's not in your models.
So we have, okay, so we have so many heterogeneity models. So we don't have them in our primary models, we don't have any controls. So here we have, so victim of state violence and victim of non-state armed group violence are both significant. And if there are any particular ones you're interested in, I don't have them all here, but I can find the figures in the paper. So there is heterogeneity by that. Yes. Thanks.
Great way I'm hearing tell us a bit more about the states of the findings. So what, how do we put that within the context of like organizers, this is about finding social movement, like.
Yeah. So this is like the question that I'm always scared to get. No, not because I like, it's the best question, but it's also like the hardest and the most important question. And I'm like terrified of being wrong about like policy implications of my work. I mean, on the one hand, like one implication of this is like protest by being stereotypical women, if you want people to like your protests. But like normatively, I don't think I want to endorse that. Yeah, or something like that. Like be less subversive when you protest. But on the other hand, I don't think like there are reasons to be subversive, right? Like the goal of a protest is not necessarily to garner public support for your protest, right? So I think we have like a very vague policy implication section in the end because of this sort of tension. Yeah.
Something like, what is the goal of a protest? And if you are interested in X, Y, Z, it might suggest this path if you're interested in this. And then even more than that, I think what's interesting about what you said, and these are the questions that arise essentially introduced without saying specifically, right?
Yeah.
So different stakeholders might have different goals for protests, and the implications of the findings are different in all ways.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. That's a helpful way to think about it. As opposed to being like, here's what policies should implement protesters. Yeah, you go first.
I know at the beginning,
Yeah. So she asked whether we found everything we had hypothesized. So I think overall, I would say we found support for our big picture argument that both social and physical threat matter. I think it's particularly where we had like sort of counteracting hypotheses that we don't know how to interpret our goals either way. But I think on the whole, we found support for our arguments. I saw another hand somewhere. Yeah.
So if I understand correctly, you wouldn't want to think of this as a horse race between violence and the sort of social threat.
Yeah.
And violence, right?
Yeah.
Because the way it's set up, these various profiles or settings aren't really controlling for what right?
Yeah. So originally we tried to figure out a design where we could isolate them, but we could not come up with enough attribute levels that were only physical or only social threats. Like we were like knocking our heads against the wall. And because we wanted to do this horse race, my husband calls this paper the topless horse races paper. He doesn't know what it's about, but that's like what he calls this paper. But then in the end, we couldn't do it. So we have all of these attributes that have like varying levels of both of these, which is sort of imperfect from like a design perspective. But we could not figure out how to do it in a cleaner way.
Well, do you have a distribution of how, like, did you fully have all 64, whatever it was? The
Combinations?
Or do you have distributions and we know how many and which ones had?
I don't know. I don't think I have the data in my appendix about it. I mean, there are probably some that we don't have. I think the more important way to, so like numerically we have, a quarter of each demand, but not every combination. We have, and this is, I can pull this up if it's like helpful. So we have like a bunch of heterogeneity tests, for example, by like different, if you combine different attribute levels together. So I don't know how to do the tech if I pull it up. I don't think they're in here. They're in an entirely separate figure. So you can look at basically heterogeneity by attribute level combinations. So like if we look at like just pro-abortion protests, how are people responding the other way? And a lot of our results are robust to that. But we don't do it by isolating like specific combinations. Yeah.
I was just curious what you thought about, so you talked about kind of framing the question in a way that suggests that you were asking, like, are you pro repression?
Yeah.
But that's interesting because it also assumes that there's like a taboo against that, and there's certain ways of saying that would not be in a taboo type way to other people. I'm just curious what you think about now that you've done all this work. What if the question was posed in the way that you guys decided not to take that? Did you find the same things, or in what ways you think?
I mean, here's hoping. Because if not, then the whole sort of argument falls apart. So I think what we would get just in terms of our results if we did that, is I think right-wingers would be perfectly happy to be like, yeah, the police should, what are these protesters doing? But I think that either left-wing respondents or people who are poorer or not white would feel a lot less comfortable answering. So we would get heterogeneity by like social desirability bias across different groups that I don't think we get here, but like that's not equally sort of threatening or indelicate for everyone, right? Like there are lots of wealthy people who can be like, yeah, the police should repress them, obviously. Like I'm a conservative, I have lots of money, I am the status quo, right? But like the risks faced by the state, from the state are not equal across the population. It was a very long-winded answer, but I have no idea what I would get. We haven't run it, I'm not sure. Other thoughts? Yeah.
Can you work on this enumeration with the survey firm? There's a pilot phase and then you go out and how much input do the enumerators and people who have experience running these surveys give to that? From my experience, it can be a really enlightening process for somebody to say, but you can't ask about conversation in this area.
Yeah.
Or for somebody to say, no, I think you should ask about these things.
Yeah, super helpful. So from a like process perspective, so there are sort of two levels of like research people in this. So the first is like the staff of the survey firm, and they look at this, and we talk to them before the experiment. They are more highly educated and wealthier. And then we go out, and the actual piloting is done by enumerators, and they tend to be very much like regular people. So I have like conversations with them during the pilot, and then we have like a debriefing day after, in which we change a bunch of stuff. I think in this, there weren't any like really big questions where they were like, you can't ask that, that's not okay. I think the biggest input that they've had is like in terms of like cognitive load, essentially, and like the experience that they're having with respondents when they show up on the street and they say, I'm going to show you 6 things, and then I'm going to show you those 6 things 5 more times, right? And like thinking about like reducing the inconvenience that a survey is. They were also really helpful in thinking about like the in terms of like the stratas and like the weird decisions we made about like who is going to say no to this survey. Like they know that much better than we do, I think. Yeah, luckily there were no like huge ethical red flags that they put up in this one. There were in another survey that I had done a few years ago, but in this one they were mostly okay with the questions we were asking. It was more so about slimming our design. A classic. Yeah, Jamie.
So this is a big question. When you look at all the results you have and you think about them, do you think that there is, or do you feel good or bad? Do you think that the results show you that there is strong support for freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, or do you worry that there is not strong support for freedom of speech?
Well, I feel good because my hypotheses were mostly correct, but I feel bad because people are biased. I mean, this is like a question you could ask about all my research. Like, I exclusively study people thinking awful things. Normatively.
But I mean it. But like, what is your sense of what do your findings tell you about the level of support?
I think what they tell me is that you only get freedom of assembly if you are performing the role that you were assigned. There's freedom of assembly for some kinds of people doing some kinds of things, which I don't think is freedom of assembly at all. But I think that is sort of, I don't think that this is like a happy finding for like the public support for these freedoms is robust. I don't think we find that. Yeah.
So I want to push it a little bit on how you just described it, the student on the role, playing the role that you're supposed to do. I don't know that I think you were ever measuring roles. So you measured, topics and get my speech goals, and then you measured actions, tactics.
Yep.
In the moment of protest. And so I wonder if you could say more about how you get from that to this is about goals.
Yeah, for sure. So I think there are sort of 2 ways to think about this. So one way is just to be like, and this is sort of what we did, is like, this is the status quo, right? The patriarchal status quo, and what are deviations from that, which is super abstract. I think another thing we did, and this is once again, like one of my many tables that I don't have here. So we asked people whether they agreed that women can only realize their potential via motherhood, and whether the police have the right to demand compliance with the law, right? So these are sort of individual respondents' beliefs broadly about like gender and the police, and we looked at like variation by that, which is imperfect, right? So like the alternative to doing this is like to do sort of much more long form interviews and ask people about what they think women should be doing, what role women serve in society, and then talk through protests. And I think that gets a lot deeper into the question. I mean, then you get the classic trade-off of like experimental design in larger N versus sort of lower N, but like more in-depth interviews, right? And I don't think that there's like a perfect answer for that trade-off here. Yeah.
I know that about the military groups. Is there a potential for kind of longitudinal look at this? Because it's decommissioning arms, it's happening in places like Ireland as well. And now those same groups have worked quite hard to take on this solely political identity rather than a paramilitary identity.
Yep.
And that changes how you see some progress and moral way. Other people trying to look at that longitudinally because it's quite recent, right? Some of this surrender and decommissioning.
Yeah.
What your grandparents thought was a paramilitary group, your grandchildren might think is just a paramilitary.
Yeah. There's sort of the cross-national work, and there's a lot of interesting work on like rebel groups turning into political parties. I haven't seen sort of cross-national work on like public attitudes towards that. Within Colombia, there was obviously demobilization of the FARC in 2016, but the issue is that lots of sort of fighters didn't disarm, and of course there was a proliferation of other groups sort of seeping into the areas that the FARC formerly occupied. So there are still lots of armed groups in the country, which makes it plausible to say that like, oh, leaders are affiliated with some kind of armed group. I've been in so many talks where where I've like said something and people have been like, but Colombia's at peace. There was a peace agreement. And like, I think that is like yes, there was a peace accord, but like there, like a solid, like probably 20% of the country still has the presence of non-state armed groups. Yeah.
I just want to take advantage of being able to say violence and you mentioned the number of people killed in protest and thinking about that as this extreme measure on the spectrum of protest. Do you have any idea, like from knowing the literature, how do we conceptualize? I guess two thoughts: like conceptualizing violence, state repression of protests. Does killing protesters, and I'm just thinking of a few examples off the top of my head, I would imagine that that's kind of like a catalytic event for a lot of other things. Is that true? Does the literature show that when the state kills protesters, things change fundamentally, and that kind of pivot is different than, let's say, spraying tear gas or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think there is some work that suggests that like people don't like police repression. But I haven't seen work that you would need sort of a dynamic model over time, looking at public support day by day as protests change. I've seen some work on this in like the Black Lives Matter movement. But they didn't look specific, there's been some work looking at like George Floyd. That's sort of similar. And that has, because the US has big data. So they have like daily survey measures, and then they can look at like basically events that change. But what I think we don't know is like which deaths catalyze changes in public opinion, right? Like, I mean, even if we're looking at like Minneapolis, like there have been other violent incidents that have to greater or lesser degrees caught the attention of the public. And there's like that whole other process of like when deaths become sort of public and the public cares. That's a whole other level that I think we need to take into account. So there's some work, but off the top of my head, I don't know like a perfect piece that would speak to your question.
Yeah, I think it's relevant in the conversation you're having about what is intervention.
Yeah, for sure. No minutes left. Okay. Well, thank you so much, guys.